There's a lot of idiots out there who will tell you that the US's aid to Ukraine has been a raw deal for the United States. But when we dig into the math, we realize that it is not just the right thing to do, it is very, very profitable. I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about it. So we've turned a little bit to Google's AI, right? Because they can just search things a lot faster. And to understand how we can look at the prospect of Ukraine aid, what we can generate are two scenarios for the way the war ends, right? The first is a pivot to the West. This is a Western victory, right? So Ukraine remains a democratic country. Its leaders maintain their orientation towards not just NATO, but the EU as well. It's a sign of a pivot towards the West and towards a Western style of economic development. On the other side is a loss for the West, right? Where Ukraine becomes a Russian proxy, right? And lucky for us, we actually have two countries that in fact model those two scenarios. One is Poland, right? And why do I really like using Poland as an example? Because in 2004, it was a post-Soviet country that was economically destitute, but it still managed to come and into the EU, joining the EU in 2004. So this is a huge moment for Poland, right? And you can see why. Take a look at the chart generated from Google. You can see that in 2004, right, the trade volume, this is all the goods and services that Poland sends to us and all the things that we get to sell to Poland combined, right? This is a good measure of the economic value that two countries provide each other. Because again, if you're a US business, it's great to be able to purchase Polish goods, and it's also great to be able to sell things to Polish citizens. So you can see that as soon as they joined the EU, the Polish relationship to the US, right? This isn't even the EU, but this is when I talk about a Western orientation. This is what I mean, right? Their economy grows. If you can sell things to Europe, you can also sell them to the United States, right? Because you can transit through Europe easily. So again, and we're only doing the math based on the United States. So this is what happens when a country goes from a post-Soviet economy, right, to a Western European one. You can see that in 2004, the year it joined the EU, Poland was around $15 billion of trade with the United States. And then it went on a rocket ship. For the next 20 years, other than two economic crises, you know what these are, the 2008 crisis and the COVID crisis, the trade volume with the US has grown exponentially, right? So you can see that what started as a mere $15 billion of trade is now sitting at around $35 billion in just 20 years. That's less time than it takes to pay off a house. So let's scroll down and learn a little bit more. When we look at the percentages, right? What did this growth percentage look like? And you can see that especially those first couple years, Poland was on a rocket ship. They had access to new markets and new companies were coming into Poland to invest. And it grew their economy massively before settling into a much more stable growth rate of around 8%. 8%, by the way, guys, is an insanely fast growth of trade volume. But there's another potential outcome, and this is that it becomes Belarus. Belarus is a country which is dominated by Russia. Their leader, Lukashenko, is considered Putin's lapdog in a lot of cases. And for Belarus, right, they have a robust military and economic cooperation with Russia, namely that Russia dictates how things are going to be done, and Belarus says, yeah, okay. So what does that mean for the relationship with the U.S.? Well, if you look at the same time period, you can see that Belarus seemed to be on kind of a Western orientation until around 2007. And then Putin decided he needed Belarus in the Russian economic sphere. And what happened? Well, trade volume with the US steadily declined. And this corresponds with an economic decline in Belarus itself. In fact, over 20 years, the total trade volume, this is in millions, by the way, that's how impoverished Belarus is. It's even at its baseline, it was a fraction of the Polish economy. It still is now doing about half the trade volume today that it was in 2004. So what does this mean for Ukraine? Well, these are the two scenarios of a win and a loss. So let's pull it up. I've got a nice little helpful chart here. This is Poland, right? And as you guys can see, in the 20 years that followed the Polish integration into the West, EU, NATO membership, etc., you could see that the trade volume with the United States went from about $8.5 billion all the way to an absolutely eye-watering $45 billion. And that's just in 20 years. Remember, guys, countries don't disappear in the span of a couple years. They're not like your house, your mortgage. Those relationships go on indefinitely, right? The United States, we can measure our relationship to a country like the UK or France in terms of centuries. So that is a recalibration we have to do. But for purposes of this, we're just going to talk about 30 years, right? A blink of an eye in terms of countries' relationships. So let's say that we win in Ukraine, that the West wins, Ukraine becomes a democratic country with a Western EU orientation, right? NATO, EU, free trade agreements, all of it. What happens? Well, currently, I'm using currently. The actual year is, so I'm using 2021's Ukraine trade volume. And the reason is because the trade data gets screwed up because, Russia was trying to destroy their country. So it's unfair to use it. But the year leading up to, the year prior to, right? Remember, Russia was still occupying a percentage of Ukraine during that year, right? So you have $4.4 billion in trade between the US and Ukraine. So let's say the war ends in 2025 and that trade volume resumes, but it gets on the Polish plan, the Polish development plan. What does that mean? Well, using Poland's actual data, which again includes two major economic crises slowing the growth globally, still the trade volume grows and grows and grows. And by about year 20, the US and Ukraine are doing $23 billion in trade. Now, here's the question. How long will it take Ukraine in trade volume to pay off that aid we provided them? Now, we've talked on this channel ad nauseum about the fact that the Ukraine aid math is not the same thing as it's not writing them a check. We've written them several $billion in straight checks to help their government, to help pay, for example, their ambulance workers or help pay the salaries of soldiers. Absolutely. But a lot of that aid is in old shit the US had in its garage. Like, no kidding. Those HIMARS systems, they were built in the 90s and were slated to get replaced. So what were they worth to the United States? Nothing. But when we say how much did we give to Ukraine in aid, we use Pentagon math. And Pentagon math can be a bunch of different things, but for these purposes, it seems like it was whatever you paid for that system at the time. And so it's sort of like saying, hey, I have this old Corolla parked behind my house. And for years, I've wanted to get rid of the thing and buy a nice new Tesla. I know that's a contradiction, but we're fine. I want to buy a nice new Tesla. So and you say, your neighbor goes, listen, man, actually, my car just broke down and I really need it to get to work. Why don't you give me your car and you can buy yourself a new Tesla? You finally have the excuse. And so if you're the United States, you go, that's a great deal, right? And just like what I would do if I gave my car away to a friend, right? I might go to the IRS and say, well, listen, that Corolla, I paid 32 grand for it or 25 grand for it back in 99. So that's the tax write-off that I want to claim for this generous gift. I know you can't. I know that's not how tax law works. Don't worry about it. But that's what the US is doing with their math too. They say we gave away all these old artillery systems. Sure, they were never going to be used by our troops ever again, But we were going to buy these new fancy artillery systems anyway. But for purposes of accounting, we just gifted Ukraine billions of dollars in artillery systems, even though they were worth nothing. So the math is a little fuzzy, but let's take it at face value. Let's say that $175 billion we gave them is actually $175 billion in brand spanking new military gear. How long will it take to pay off that amount of aid? The answer is 15 years, which again, the relationship between these countries should be measured in decades, right? So what is the 30-year return? Again, just the length of a standard mortgage. What is the return on investment of our $175 billion if Ukraine wins? The answer is over 30 years, we're going to make 352%. And again, it's not like Ukraine is going to pack up its bags and stop existing in 2055. It's still going to be a country. And there's still going to be trade happening, right? So we could think about this in terms of 50 years, and it would be completely reasonable, right? Does the U.S. have a 50-year relationship with a country like Germany? Yeah, absolutely we do, right? We have a 50-year relationship with a country like Italy, right? Turkey. Countries normally have centuries-long relationships. And so when you create these conditions, right, there's one thing we can know, it's that nobody likes losing money. And so you think Ukraine going forward, right, by 2055, guys, by the way, Ukraine will be paying back the $175 billion that we gave them. They'll be paying it back every 3 years, guys. Every 36 months, they'll be churning over another 150 billion in trade volume. So this is one of the things that I think people forget, right? And listen, doing the right thing, defending democracy, crushing one of America's geopolitical enemies, these are all good things. But the question is, yeah, it's really great to do the right thing, but it's even greater to do the right thing and make bank for it. And in the case of aid to Ukraine, we could literally double the amount we've given them, and it would still be unbelievably profitable. Because remember, we just used the United States and Ukraine trade volume as an example. And here's the magic of the US system. Here's why people stand for it so hard. Here's why when they survey countries, they all want to have this closer relationship with the US, especially European countries, is because Ukraine's also going to be trading with Europe. They're going to get access to the EU market. The EU has said, when this war ends, we'll bring Ukraine on board. So now Ukraine's going to get that EU market access, which means that every other Ukrainian is going to have a massive growth spurt, right? The Polish economy in total has more than doubled in size, right? And, oh yeah, the EU is also going to benefit. They are going to have the same chart for themselves. And the EU economy, remember, is as big as the United States, but they've contributed only a fraction. What does that mean? That means that while the EU collectively has given, let's say, $100 billion, they're going to have an even larger return on investment. Oh, and who are they going to have to thank for that? The United States. But a bunch of other knock-on effects would happen too. A prospering Ukraine, every other neighboring country like Moldova or Georgia is going to look and say, damn, Ukraine beat the brakes off the Russians, the West backed them up, and then the Ukrainians got rich, right? Imagine they're going to say that was the deal of a lifetime. Meanwhile, we're sitting here doing Putin's bidding, dominated by Russia, getting broker by the year. Imagine you're Belarus. This is what your economy looks like, okay? And then you look across the border and you see the Ukrainians driving nicer cars, buying iPhones. Every other country is going to say, we want to get in on that. And when you do that, you know what you have? You have even more of these kind of relationships, these supercharged, powerful economic relationships delivering massive returns, right? And so this is why the math is clear. If you should want to support Ukraine, because dictatorships and democracies are not, in fact, the same. But even if you don't give a shit about Ukraine, if you want to live in a prosperous country, you need to see Ukraine beat the shit out of the Russians. Anyway, guys, hit that subscribe button for me. Thanks to Bill Collier, Robert Colburn, Gaius Martin, Gina Cuesta, Quiz Gorsuch, Franz Zacharias, AL90, Petra Toru, all the Lieutenant tier members. I appreciate you guys. I couldn't do it without you, and I will see you all in the next one. Cheers.